we were used to always having open shelters, and here we're using clear polyethylene to build a shelter, and we still leave an open window facing the fire.
Uh-huh.
Well, that took about 10 years before, you realize, hey, why don't you just cover it, and you're going to have you can cover it completely, and the fire nearby is going to create a situation where you're very cozy.
Was that, so putting the poly in the front, was that almost by accident, or were you trying to keep smoke out?
Well, it never occurred to me till I was on a camp out, and I had a high school group out, and everybody, you get your, generally for most purposes, you find it's convenient. The group of students you get, building your own shelter is 4 times as much work as sharing a shelter with 3 other people. So the 4 of you, and you find that 3 of you is a starter where you generate enough combined warmth. You produce the same amount of heat as a candle. And if you got 3 people sharing the shelter, so it's 300 BTUs. So when 3 of you, it's 1,000 BTUs that you have to work with. So it means that if you build the right type of shelter, 3 people might allow you to virtually sleep on in your clothing rather than a sleeping bag.
Mm-hmm.
And so you realize that the 3 people sharing a shelter means that they're going to, if they create a bubble. Well, of course, polyethylene being clear, it acts like a greenhouse. So wanting to know what the mechanism is, you read the books on greenhouse construction. So in reality, you've got the 2 extreme shelters. You've got the igloo, which depends on the insulation of the thickness of the snow,
mm-hmm.
whereas the greenhouse depends on creating a clear part of the shelter is clear so that the radiance of the sun can get in and bring the temperature up. Or if you have enough people, and you build a big enough parachute shelter, you can get 60 kids inside. You don't need to have a fire because when the 60 kids who can sit in, an ordinary parachute shelter that uses the parachutes that are 13 and a half to the side, you can get 60 elementary school kids in there. And you actually find that very, very quickly they're shedding their clothing because the temperature really goes up high enough that you actually start sweltering a bit. So, all these little things, they would all come together. So I began to get an idea about all the features that come in to be harnessed, to be exploited. So if you got enough people sharing a small enough shelter with a low enough ceiling, then just body heat. Well, being a farm kid, you find that you would house the milk cows in a barn overnight,
mm-hmm.
and you go in there and you actually, you even have to find that maybe it helps to vent that barn because the cows produce so much moisture and other things. But that the cattle themselves, they heat the, so in Holland, the barn portion would be the lower part of your house and the upper part is so you don't have to heat the house because you keep the cattle in the barn. And of course you see these very gorgeously dressed, good-looking Dutch girls, but they do have a kind of a cow smell about them. They live above the barn, and they depend on the heat that is generated by the cattle that occupy that space.
And that was a reality not long ago, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, that was the common way to sort of use animal heat instead of having to, in Holland, firewood is not that, even coal, everything would have to be hauled from long distances. So if there is a means, but the dairy operation, that's already there. Not exploit the heat generated by the cattle by building the residence over top of the barn, stuff like that.
So a lot of the background that you see in like the survival end of things, you find that a lot of it came from the wilderness living, the farming, and means to survive through those hard times. Do you think a lot of that crosses over that way, the wilderness living and survival?
Well, my parents happened to be what we would call forest people. That is, that they depended on a nearby forest to extend what they needed or wanted. So forest people usually have their bit of farmland, and so you raise enough meat in the form of pigs, and the pigs can go forage on the common lands. You don't have to necessarily. So the piece of property that you had was essentially maybe in its strictest form would be to grow a big garden. Now, if you had more property, you would have pasturage. You had more property, you would have a means to cut hay to make you get by the winter, things like that. So basically, if you had common lands, which would be sort of on the verge of unfarmable land, like the hills and the steep, rocky places, you could pasture there. But you needed a bit of the flat lowland that's near the river for your garden to grow all the things that nature doesn't provide, like potatoes and carrots and stuff like that. But anyway, my parents came from that type of a setting. So, of course, when they immigrated here, they were most comfortable if they had access to the forest. So it means that I got a head start. So people will often ask me, what's the difference between you and so-and-so? And I say, well, it was because I was brought up in that situation by parents who were forest people. That means forest people, they don't catch fish on their own property. They go elsewhere in the environment, mushrooms, berries. So by the time I was probably into elementary school, I could gather mushrooms, because when the mushrooms are out, it's a serious operation to harvest as many mushrooms and dry them for future use. And if you want to have the benefit of the mushrooms in the middle of winter, you have to harvest them and dry them. But know that there's a time when they're available, and then know how to dry them so that they maintain their nutritional values.
What is the best way to dry them naturally like that?
Well, to lay them out, probably in the attic, out of direct sunlight. So it means that higher up, underneath the roof, the temperature of a normal building, the log house and so on, generally the attic is the hottest place in the house. So you spread out. A lot of things are spread out there.
What sort of other things are spread out in the attic that you want to dry for winter?
The common thing was my mother made her own soap.
Okay.
And the soap was the convenience is that when you make a large quantity of soap, then you want to put it in a place where it hardens and consolidates. And so the soap is kind of not very stiff. And every time you butcher a pig, the likelihood is that you'll end up making a batch of soap.
By rendering down fat?
Yeah, you just put all the fat in a big pot, and generally you separate the rind out of the fat, and so now you've got lard. Now, if you subject lard to the right amount, the one concession there is that you could buy the lye, Gilbert's lye. That's the main component of making hard soap. Whereas probably back in Europe, you would save the ash from you would extract the base material that enters into the manufacture of soap. So,
Must be quite the process to separate the ash, no?
Well, it's a kind of a wooden affair where as you pour water in it, it trickles through the ash, and if enough water is poured in there, it eventually starts to find its way out. It would be like a conical type bin, and
almost like
periodically, maybe once a day, you pour. You want it. You don't want to pour so much that it runs through quickly.
Interesting.
You end up pouring enough that maybe you're getting a few cupfuls. So it's doing it frequently, like maybe once a day. You eventually have concentrated the corrosive material that's found in ash, and then the ash goes on the garden. And so the ash gives you the material to produce soap, but that's a soft soap. That's a liquid soap.
Oh, okay.
Whereas when you see the stuff that you're getting out of the wood ash, generally the type of wood we would have here, that's I think that's called potassium hydroxide. Whereas the stuff that Gilbert's lye, which is a very, very brutal material, very, you get a crystal of it. It's apt to eat away a good patch of skin.
And here we are bathing
that's called
in this.
sodium hydroxide.
Okay.
So that's such a concentrated hydroxide that it produces hard soap. So it's of that nature. They're both just as detergent, but generally you find when you're using soap, the way I would remember, you'd make this soap, and it's got quite a bacon smell about it. But when you're washing, I'm so old, that is, it was quite a while before the washing machine came on the scene. I mean, I probably would have been 8 years old, where finally you get this washing machine with a gas motor, and you'd start it, and you'd have this. Otherwise, it's a washboard, and a big and a tub, and so the washboard, you would rub the soap either on the washboard itself, or you got the wet garment and you rub it, and that's how you get enough soap detergent to be able to launder, you might say. So when I was born, it was like a lot happened all of a sudden around about age 10, you might say, because there was horses. I mean, even going to town, which was 10 away, which would take longer to drive with a horse and wagon to Prince Albert than it is to drive from my place to Edmonton, 200 kilometers away. But, so things speed up a great deal. For the one of my older brother who needed to go to high school, he had to room and board. Well, today kids drive 50 kilometers or more to get to school on a daily basis, because you find that the brutalization of putting all the school so 600 kids could show up at one school instead of 30. So it saves a building a school for every 30 people instead of a school for 600 kids. And then when kids get together like that, there's a certain dynamics that reflected in how we socialize and how we live and whatever. But anyway,
I remember to bring it back to the food aspect of things. I remember a couple of years ago, you and I were traveling to Minnesota, and you were mentioning how it would be no thing for your dad to leave for multiple weeks to go fishing, to fill up barrels of fish and salt it. And what kind of would that look like, and what else were those things that getting ready for winter in those hard months?
Yeah, well, the lake where the ice fishing was feasible was far enough away, and the length of time you'd spend, usually I can remember that generally there was 2 45-gallon barrels, and so the fish are, when you catch them, you put a layer of them and then cover that with snow, so that that's the way it was done. That extended the they